o'clock, so we'll start here. Thank you all for joining us. I have to say, before I get started, that this is a tough job. It's not an easy role to be in. Always, it's kind of stressful sometimes, at least on the bad days. But it's moments like this where we can be together in person and discuss the issues facing our state in a real, coherent way that give me the energy to continue on in those stressful moments, and I'm sure the same can be said for Peter. So we are about a week away from our first filing period. We have 2 in the first year of the legislative session, that being the full biennium. So the first year we'll have 2 weeks. First one is in September, the 1st through the 11th, and then the second one is in November after the general election to file legislation. And so Peter and I will talk a little bit about what we're thinking of in the first filing period, but overall why we have chosen to run for office again for another 2 years and serve up in the State House. And so with that, I'll hand it off to Peter, who will begin the why we ran for office again.
Is this working?
Yes.
So, as we say in Concord for the record, my name is Peter. Hello, hello. So I'm Peter Leishman. If those of you here are new or don't know me, I've served in the legislature for some time. On the Finance Committee now, I'm finishing out my 9th term. I also serve on the Joint Legislative Fiscal Committee, which is 5 reps and 5 senators. We meet monthly to try to balance the state's needs when the legislature is not in session. So we've been very busy because we're struggling moving money from one area to the other to keep the state going. Corrections is a big problem that's generally funded. Our population is increasing, the prison is falling down, and it's a real headache for our capital improvements program going forward. But so why am I running? I still enjoy it. I believe in term limits, and you folks all have that power to end our terms. So as you see in many races, there's been a lot of changes out there. There's a lot of movement because people are upset the way things are going nationally and on a state level. The state is cut deeply into revenue sources. The last term, we had the interest and dividends tax removed, which was $182 million a year lost. Our business taxes have been declining because of changing rates and collection. We did have a fairly good amnesty program. The Department of Revenue supported people that weren't paying their taxes, that they could pay their taxes, and they forgive penalties and interest that collected over $100 million. We don't have that this time going in, so it will be a very difficult year. If I do return and go back to the Finance Committee, I was talking to some of my colleagues just last week, and those of us on the Democratic side of the aisle feel that we may return to power, if you will, but that could be a double-edged sword because we are facing major cuts in revenue. And most of us here, I believe, want to see more money coming back from the state, not less. Although last year, because of some changes in formula, Peterborough actually got a slight increase in state funding, but there was a large chunk that went to the school for special needs students. So there was an uptick a little bit. I think Peterborough gets about $6 million a year in state aid as funding from the flood control dams here in town. The state often has to pay for that because Massachusetts and Connecticut are always late making payments. There are a number of issues, of course, with education. A lot of debate in the Freedom Education accounts. I see my friend Patty Long here, who I think that's why I stuttered a bit because I looked at her when I said Freedom accounts. But right now, the Education Freedom accounts is taking a big chunk out of aid for municipalities for general education, and there's no income threshold. So if you're rich or poor or in between, it doesn't matter if you want to homeschool your kids or send them elsewhere, the state will help you with that. And I think that's very unfair to local taxpayers that are sending their money up to support their community, and it's going to folks that can afford to send their kids to private school or elsewhere, and they're getting a check from the state. But I won't take any more time. I'm glad you're here. Happy to answer any questions. Peterborough and Sharon are never afraid to ask questions. send us emails. I know a lot of you here are often writing to either Jonah or myself, and we want you to continue that. So Jonah, there you go.
Thank you, Pete. Separate mic. Corinne sets us up right, even though that one I think is the one that works better.
Give you a reason for that.
I guess so.
Well, you gotta share, especially in a state house that only makes so much money, right? But we are, I mean, Peter, I think illustrated that quite well. I am in my 4th year in office. Peter has been in office a little bit longer than I have. But we, Peter and I, have been just a little.
Before he was born.
I wasn't gonna say that.
Quarter of a century.
Now they're debating. But what I can say is the legislature is going through a very interesting moment in time. We all know this. New Hampshire's state government has existed since the year 1680, so just about 400 years of existence of governing the land in this state in an English-style government. And so we have a tradition of government that lasts a little bit longer than some of the other 50 states here in this country. And we also can say confidently that this was the first state to pass a constitution about 6 months before the federal government did theirs in Philadelphia. But more importantly, we were the first state to reject a constitution through peaceful means. Now we did that because we, in our provincial era, 1680 to about 1784, when that constitution was passed, had a very powerful executive branch. An executive branch that looked at the legislature as no more than a sideshow. We had a people's court. They had grievances brought from the citizens of the state. That was mostly the 4 towns, Dover, Portsmouth. The other 2 I don't want to get wrong, have a Rick Perry moment, so I won't even try. But these towns elected their citizens, brought them to the legislature, and did their best to go up against a royal governor who extracted rents, raised penalties on people for frivolous means, etc. He was an executive who, many of them, were executives who usurped the power given to that branch and then expanded on it to try and say that the people, the citizens of this once a colony, once a province, now a state, no longer have a say in their state government. And so the people of the state of New Hampshire were given a vote on the Constitution in the ballot box at about the year in the late 1700s. And they voted to reject that initial Constitution and then to come back in a couple of different rounds because they wanted an executive branch that didn't have as much power as the one that they had lived under for about 40 years. They wanted a people's government, a House of Representatives, and that was one of the first times that term had been used in our state constitution, to serve the citizens of the state of New Hampshire, which has lasted for about 250 years now from that first initial constitution. So Peter and I walk into a building with a golden dome that has existed since the year 1819, 207 years of legislative business, wherein now it is being led by people who really don't have, and I don't want to be too pointed against people, you know, everyone has, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. There are very few people out there who think they're being bad, so I try to be as nice as I can to colleagues. But I do have to say that the leadership, not just in this last 2 bienniums, as Peter has seen over the course of his time in the State House from the 90s to now, degradation in the basic civility functions of that body. And so as Peter and I are looking at a situation in which people are spending $12,000 a year to live in a house on a fixed income, while the schools, not just the buildings themselves crumble, but the education within crumbles, while our roads and bridges can't get fixed, while our state government atrophies, I think we're looking at a situation where we need true leaders who are going to bring back the civility in that body, the basic mechanics of the institution, such that the 400 members of the House of Representatives, the 24 members of the Senate, the governor, are working as much as we can in a collaborative way to find solutions to our high taxes, our atrophying schools, our state government being taken over by people who simply don't believe in a public sector. Peter and I believe in a public sector. We believe in a public government, open, honest, and transparent, accountable to each and every one of you, the 1.5 million people in our state, who are going to be able to go to their government, tell them their grievances, and then have those grievances acted on. And so whether it's our belief that we need to address the property tax issue or the environment in our state so that it's there for our children and our grandchildren, or the food and food safety in the state, or all the different issues that we're facing, Peter and I are running again, at least I know I am, because those solutions absolutely exist. I've got my opinions, Peter's got his, but they exist within the bounds of a deliberative republic that elects people who are committed to that deliberative republic, coming together and collaborating on those solutions. So I am serving at least another 2 years, a privilege to be elected again, and in doing that for those 2 years, we'll work for a collaborative government where all 398 other members other than Peter and I in the State House have a say in their committee, on the House floor, and in the creation of the bills that are going to solve the crises that we're facing in our state that I'm looking forward to talking about here. So with that, we'll open it up for the next hour to questions. Does anyone have the coveted first question? Sharon.
I just wanted to know what you are planning on proposing legislation coming up real soon. You know, what do you have in the works?
Peter says I can go first. No,
Oh, okay.
no, I'm happy to go first. My first round of bills will be something along the lines of an equalization of the property tax rate. So we have a situation in this state, as we're all aware, that the state, Peter and I were talking last Wednesday during our veto day, looking at tax revenues in the nation for state revenues. We fund our state at about 60% property taxes. So our state is funded by about 59.51% property taxes, just under 60%. The closest state to us in funding as much as they do through property taxes is at about 35%. Connecticut, and that was 35% of property taxes. And that, I think, illustrates the situation we're going through pretty well. Peter talks about some of the revenues that we've lost. The more that a state relies on one stream of revenue and does so in a way that taxes the poor, property poor towns in our state, like Claremont, Jaffrey, others, and leaves the property wealthy districts in our state with money in the bank, fully funded schools, the more that we're going to continue to atrophy our system. And so what I believe in is doing what they did in 1999. It's statewide education property tax. It still exists now, but in 2006, the legislature made a change where instead of a tax where it generates revenue based off of the data in the state currently, it has a set revenue amount. And so right now, the SWEP raises a set amount of $363 million. It doesn't matter if the property poor districts or the property rich districts, we have to get to a $363 million amount, regardless of anything else, for no particular reason. It's just that is what the state said was the better way to go forward in doing SWEP. And then the more important change that was made to SWEP that brings us to the position that we're in now is in 2011, when Bill O'Brien was Speaker of the House, he, alongside, and both of these changes were signed into law by Governor John Lynch. They were sort of bipartisan changes that were made, but done in a Republican House, signed by a Democratic governor, and this was the case as well for this last change. Bill O'Brien passed through his majority, supermajority in the House, an allowance for towns to withhold what we now call excess SWEP. Now, I say we now call because this is a state tax raising state revenue for a state system. And the idea that there is any excess to that is town's money, is a very clever propaganda tactic used by the wealthy towns in our state who don't want to subsidize the property poor districts in our state to make sure that they can have an education that meets the standards which they are able to get for their children. So we have a situation where advocating for this, the New Hampshire Journal, sort of a right-leaning newspaper in the state, when I put out my video on this issue a couple of weeks ago, said, Jonah Wheeler wants to get this back to donor towns. And I said, well, I'm not gonna cave to your framing on this issue. It's not donor towns. This is a state tax and a state system for education statewide. This isn't donor towns. We're talking about a state system, and our state constitution passed in the late
18th century, says very clearly that we cherish education and that we want to fund education and make sure that each student in our state is provided an education. That's Article 5, Part 83 of the state constitution that says that. And really that's what it comes down to. We need a state tax and a state system. So equalizing the property tax rate at about $5 per thousand would bring us from $363 million a year to an additional 1.26 for about $1.76 billion. And then with a fair distribution back to the towns based off of assessment, need, enrollment, and the rest, reality of what's happening in each school on the ground, then we can have a fair system that provides the dollars from the state to the towns that need it, and those towns will be able to lower significantly the property tax bill at a municipal level for their taxpayers. So that's probably my most important issue. Other than that, I'd like to restrict neonicotinoid pesticides in our state, and I'm probably going to deal with the fact that we have a state where sex offenders, people who are convicted of Tier 3 sexual assault, which is any sexual assault of a minor under the age of 13, can freely be about in society. Most other states have laws that say you cannot be where children are. We do not have that law here in the state of New Hampshire. We debated it last term, and so that's my three. But I'll give it to Peter before we go on to other questions for what
You
he's
want to
in
answer
file.
your question on your?
Well, we'll do what you'll file.
Go ahead, Peter.
So I've been pretty fortunate over the last couple of years that had some fairly good legislation through. It was on a bill that gave 60,000 residents health insurance, New Hampshire Health Protection Plan, they call it the Emergency Advantage now. That's always under threat. And being on the Finance Committee puts me in a unique position that I can add things or take things away or work with my colleagues. And that issue as far as Medicaid in the state is in jeopardy right now, so that's a focus I will be focusing on if I return to the House, and I'm certainly probably going to go back to the Finance Committee. But this past year, I introduced a bill, House Bill 1492, that provided protection for people that have their vehicles towed. I had heard from a number of people around the state that they were having their vehicles or trucks towed and getting bills of $20,000 to $30,000, and the vehicles weren't being released. So working with my Republican friends on the Transportation Committee, we got all the things I was looking for as far as notification of the appeal process that people didn't know existed for the Department of Safety, more time, and their vehicles couldn't be confiscated like they were before, and people couldn't get their belongings out by predatory tow truck operators. And the bill went over to the Senate, and the Senate put almost everything, I guess everything I wanted on Senate Bill 617. And there's another provision dealing with towing in that bill, so my bill passed in a sense with Senate Bill 617. So things coming up this next year, again, going to finance, I generally don't put a lot of legislation in because the Finance Committee puts a lot of legislation in individual members. There is one particular bill that I probably will file, and that would be to look at privatizing the state liquor commission. The liquor commission continues to lose money. They have a lot of debt. They built a lot of new facilities around the state. They're carrying a lot of debt. And I think most of you heard drinking is down substantially and is becoming a draw on the state. So to me, it might be time for the state to get out of the liquor business because there are a lot of people that are employed there that are also state employees that are dragging down the state retirement system. And years ago, the Liquor Commission was pretty self-supporting, but now the amount of money continues to trickle to the state coffers, where in the past it was a major source of revenue for the state. So that is one bill I would definitely be filing to look at privatizing the state Liquor Commission. So, and I'm again open to any questions. And now I guess, Kath Allen.
You know, for the last 3+ months, I've been working issues and concerns on the streets. And before I get into all that, I just had a granddaughter the other day
say, you know, if we're gonna do SWEP right, then it has to be based on the distribution method for the additional money that we raise, has to be based off of the reality of what's happening on the ground. You know, I think a lot of people who criticize the Democratic Party think that the Democratic Party is simply calling for more money to the schools and no addressing the core issues of what are happening in the schools. When I was first elected, I was an education organizer. It was my full-time job. I'm now a carpenter to take care of an elderly woman, but my first job was as an education organizer in the Nashville School District, listening sessions with the teachers and the parents and the students. And when we were speaking to the teachers and the paraprofessionals, that's exactly what they said too. We cannot deal with the increase in behavioral problems that is happening year over year. It's making our job very impossible. We have teachers who are retiring as a result. Now, part of that is not a solution. I mean, it's not something you can legislate. You know, behavior is not something you can say, I want everyone to be good and no one to be bad. How amazing would that be if we could pass a law like that? But we unfortunately cannot. But what can happen is teachers can be fully supported so that they don't feel like they need to supplement the job of teaching the next generation of students with also being a server at a local restaurant or working the night shift at a gas station. I mean, that is what teachers are having to do right now because we don't think that teacher pay, teacher retirement is an important thing to invest in as a state. I think if we did that more, I think if we made the class sizes less by investing based off of need, where teachers were dealing with less students instead of a class of almost 30 kids, then we'd be able to individualize these needs and set the system up to where the teachers would have a little bit more leeway to be able to deal with those behavioral problems. And you also brought up healthcare. It's not a bill that we're filing, Peter or I know that it is being filed with the Democratic caucus. The last budget cycle they put in for Medicaid, which is for poor people, aid the poor, care for the elderly, that's how I remember it. They put in a premium of $200 a month for anyone that participates in the Medicaid program. So if you're a poor individual who qualifies for Medicaid, which is a pretty stark level of qualification, you have to be quite poor to qualify for Medicaid. The state is now asking you to pay an additional $200 premium to it for, I think, about $34 million in state revenue because they needed to patchwork the state budget. And it wasn't just that, they needed to use the gambling revenues and others. Now we're in a situation where these revenues aren't really truly realizing themselves. You know, when you rely on gambling revenues and then the whole country basically legalizes online gambling, your revenues that you thought were going to happen are basically offset by every other state allowing online gambling. So you got every 18-year-old who has a credit card or a debit card on their phone on DraftKings or whatever, gambling their money away. And so we're not really getting that money in the charitable system. And yeah, I think a lot of that is, I mean, the behavior, the healthcare, what people are saying on the doors, I'm hearing that here in Peterborough, but also out across the state as well. So I'm being very interested.
A woman in Milford who retired $200, she said she had to come up with $50 a month, and she said, can't work, how am I gonna do it? And a volunteer who I got paid, a volunteer who was working with me, said I can buy a house anywhere in the state I want, but there's nothing available. She said, oh, so it's only $50 a month, and it's easy if you can buy a house anywhere in the state versus the woman who can't work and who's struggling.
Absolutely.
So, I just have a quick comment on the education piece again. I want to be very clear on this. Most of my Republican colleagues want to destroy traditional public education. And by cutting funds, which they're doing by siphoning funds to education freedom account or other things, it's just making it more difficult for our traditional public schools to hire the help or pay the help. So let me put that out there, and that's the truth. And I've been there long enough to see what's going on. And if we don't change things in Concord, you'll see even more deterioration in our public school system. It just lead to more people quitting or not being able to hire the staff that you need to address issues like kids fighting in the halls or whatever, because the schools are understaffed, because people aren't going to go out there like the Patty Longs of the world and work for peanuts, which you compare to the other jobs that are available in the state, that's what teachers are getting.
Mark.
Peter, about the finance committee, I just wrote a letter for Chris Pax, in which I
Don't be shy.
I just did some research on John E. Sununu's time in the Senate. He spent 6 years in the Senate until he was defeated by Jean Shaheen in 2008. And what he did was, I sent 2 letters to him, because one said that I suspected, I did research, but I found a lot of companies that have more debt than revenue. And I was, isn't that strange? Why would a company have more debt than revenue? The reason for that seems to be they acquire other companies. When they acquire other companies, their competitors, they have to pay. That's why the debt shoots up. That seems, I think some of the things John Eastman, well, he was in the Senate those few years.
Mike,
Oh, those 6 years while he was in the Senate, he eased some of the restrictions that were put in on financial, on finance, corporate finance. And these were put in during the New Deal by FDR. And they seem to have gotten, we did it since 2008. And I'm seeing across the board more and more companies with more debt than revenue, which is a strange thing. A company is $3 billion in revenue and $500 billion in debt. And that doesn't make sense, except to say that then they have power over their employees and their customers because there's no competition. So ever since this idea came, there's no harm in making money with, I forget the guy who said this during the radio before, said it's a good thing just making money, no harm. It is, there is something wrong with it. Because just making money is not, and I get this idea that at one time work really mattered, and people cared what they did, what they produced, what they made, but it now appears to be finance. And finance is a arcane art, which is I'm not saying it looks like magic, but it doesn't actually work. But it's complicated and people can make a lot of money. So, my question is, what are we doing with finance? Because this seems like a national, a worldwide trend.
Well, the finance committee of the state legislature just deals with the cost of running the state.
Correct.
And not looking into whether companies are buying other companies and assuming debt. But you raise an interesting point about debt, as you all know, that the country itself, $40 trillion, $40 trillion of debt. And any of you that know anything about history know that countries that get themselves into debt, and a good example is the British Empire, and it collapsed because of its debt. Debt that's nowhere close to what our debt is right now. But that's a real concern among my colleagues on the finance committee, because we rely heavily in the state, as most states do, on federal funds. And as the country continues to spiral out of control with its debt and spending and tariffs, it's going to be a difficult year, especially at the national level, but even on the state level for the finance committee to try to make sure that the state programs that are important to all of us are adequately funded. And a lot of my colleagues that have spent a long time in the legislature, Susan Almy, who was chairman of Ways and Means for years, other people that were on the finance committee have thrown in the towel and are not running again because it's hard. And if you're not, like I say to people, I'm not smart enough to be afraid of the situation.
Respect.
But it is troubling to any of us, especially in the state's finance, where the country is headed nationally. So the gentleman back there has a question.
I guess speaking along in line with the finance topic, I'm wondering, I guess, from both of you, if you could share a reflection on your current understanding or grappling with thinking about the prospect of AI future and primarily what I'm interested in hearing about is all of the data centers that are being talked about and your sort of how you stay oriented in that news bite.
So as far as the data centers, you probably heard that the governor now has come out against any data centers in New Hampshire because of the drawdown on the power grid, waters, and so forth. We haven't really seen a lot of AI in the legislature yet, but we all know it's out there, how that's going to affect things going forward.
I'm more interested in the data centers specifically.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, as far as any data centers in New Hampshire, that doesn't look like it's gonna happen. There was one being proposed over maybe Northwood or over in that general area, and the owner of the property pulled back due to all the opposition and the governor's position on it. The legislature, I don't believe, has taken a position on any data centers or even really talked about AI either yet. It hasn't, most of us probably are gonna struggle with it when it really becomes a problem for us, which I think it probably will at some point.
Well, you're definitely gonna have to contend with it.
Oh, yeah,
Because there's a lot of argument on the other side about the money aspect that it could bring in terms of just subsidizing their use, like their this new kind of money structure where it's going through to oligarchs and they're funding the entire town's whatever tax, to subsidize their
Yeah, I heard some example, I believe,
something
is in
like that. I have no
Ohio.
idea what I'm actually saying.
I think you're correct. It's in a town out in Ohio that I read something about that. They had come in, the water now is low. New Hampshire, you talk to my friends on the Science and Technology Committee, has an issue with power. It's very expensive here, as you know, and the availability of sources, because we've shut down our coal plants and a number of our hydroelectric facilities have been shut down. So we don't really have the infrastructure even to support maybe one data center, as I've heard. And again, that's probably you'll hear a lot more from the Science and Technology Committee that will focus on that, because that's an expertise area where they'll focus on.
Peter, the rep in Merrimack, when we go through there, she told me that don't think they've gone away, that they're still trying to build it here and make a data center somewhere in New Hampshire.
They'll try. There's a gentleman back there that has his hand.
It's hard to work from the minority as you have been. This year, it seems that tide is looking more favorably towards Democrats, and so it's possible that if there's a wave election that occurs, that you might find yourselves in the majority. I wonder, when you think about your key issues, Peter, on finance, particularly in the educational freedom accounts, if the Democrats were in the majority at some level where you might be able to have some additional ability to shape legislation or financial decisions, what that might look like for you to propose legislation or actions for finance that might reduce the amount of money or try to tip the balance back towards public schools and not these freedom accounts which benefit wealthy.
Well, I can tell you that Representative Luno, who's on the Education Committee, has probably already got that legislation ready to file. Often your policy decisions come from the policy committees, and was it 2 years ago, there was a vote to limit education freedom accounts, and it lost by 1 vote. And that's when we were just, I think, we had a minority of 5 or 6 members, but we had a number of Democrats absent that day, and that failed 2 years ago. So numbers get close, I think you're probably right, there may be a swing. I don't see the state senate going over, it's just been too gerrymandered. But the House, there is a chance, or at least if it's closer, because 2 years ago, it was close, and I served on finance that year and chaired one of the divisions of finance, and we were able to work with our Republican colleagues to get to some middle ground. But again, speaking very loudly about this, the House really needs to be controlled by at least the Democrats, because it's unlikely the Senate will be. But if you have one body there, will it help offset the actions of the other one? And you get a lot of decent budgets. And I was fortunate enough to serve 3 terms when the Democrats were in fact in power, and the Senate was controlled by the Republicans. One year we had a lot of good legislation that came on because both sides didn't want to budge, so we came to a middle ground. But what exists now, when we're like 41 members roughly in the minority, we just get stepped on. So it's hopeful that we can at least get close, or at least surpass and become the majority party as Democrats, so we make things a little easier as far as getting rid of that extreme legislation.
So can I just piggyback on his question? So, I don't know if you wanna answer it, but I think his point is, so, okay, so let's say let's say it's a perfect world when we wake up after the election. So now we have an education freedom account legislation, and when it reaches a certain number, when it reaches the 10,000, they already have the, amendment that they can add 2,500 each year. What can you do? What would you be able to do? I think this is your question, I don't know. What would you be able to do to change what's in place today?
So many people will come up to us and say, they're breaking the law, they're breaking the law. Well, the legislature, the Senate, and the governor make the laws.
Right.
So if we're in the majority, we can change past laws. So we can restrict the amount of funds that are going to education freedom accounts. We
Okay.
could eliminate it altogether.
Do
So,
you think that you could ever even have, like, you would be able to eliminate it?
well, I think there's plenty of legislators that would agree to that, but you have to get the majority vote to make that happen. So it
Right.
depends, again, if the Democrats are in charge and the Senate's controlled by the Republicans, you might get some compromise between the 2 groups and maybe establish like an income threshold, so it backs it
Yeah, right,
down.
go back to where it was before.
last.
Right, which is, the other thing about the education freedom accounts, the piece that I would like to see legislation put in that, the monies are going to people that we really can't control because the legislation's in place, okay? So like it's going to Catholic schools, okay? Or to private schools. But many of those schools do not take students that have special needs. And that's the big ticket
No,
number.
they come right back to the.
And they come to the public school. There should be legislation written that public money can be not sent to an institution that does not take a special needs child.
So I think that actually will be filed next year by one of our many Democrats.
Is there, is that?
I believe that it will be.
The education policy and education committee will have something.
I've never seen that. I've looked for that bill.
It
Is
won't
that
be
bill
there.
bid?
It won't be filed until next month, so.
Yeah, that'll be
That'll be one of those bills, because this initial filing period, we're filing blind. We don't know what the composition will be, but there are a lot of Democrats who are waiting until we know what the composition will be in the general election to file legislation like that. Because on the larger special education issue, that comes up all the time. And one of the larger conversations the State House has had is, how are we going to fund these special education students that need services and are also quite expensive for a municipal budget to take on themselves? And so a part of that conversation will be ensuring that public charter schools and any school that takes public money has to make sure that they are taking any student in. And,
But that's
it's only fair. My only gripe with moving forward with that is that's why public schools are important. Private schools have the ability to restrict who they take in. A public school must take in everybody. And so if we make the private schools take in everybody, then we're kind of just helping them out and saying, we'll continue to give you money as long as you take everybody. public school. I am hesitant to do that, but I would vote for that legislation because every student deserves an education. And if the private schools are gonna be getting public dollars, then they need to follow the same rules and regulations as the public system.
Right, I mean, I don't even know how to monitor something like that.
Oh, it'd be very simple. The Department of Education would be able to
No,
handle
but
that.
I'm saying like, so would a student that has the special needs go to a school that if, are they gonna even have the services? I mean,
Oh,
here at our
that's part
charter
of the
school,
issue.
we're covering the special ed program for them. And meanwhile, they're getting money from the state to cover that program, and they are literally double dipping. And I just don't understand, when you say they're, you know, what they're doing, what did the people say that there was like, it's against the law?
Yeah.
But it's just like, anyway, I don't really wanna have an education freedom a debate, because it's just, would get me crazy. The most important question I wanna ask you is about SWEP. I wanna know, how are you going to, those towns that have all the money,
Yeah.
they don't wanna be down, Dover town.
Right.
They get to get that money back, and then they're using it for their communities.
Right.
How are you gonna convince them
You know-
that this is gonna be good legislation for the good of the state?
Well, it's about making sure that we advocate like they did. I mean, SWEP was put in place in the 1999 Republican legislature. And so it's similar to what they'll do back then. We are in a situation where education is being unfairly had. If you're in Jaffrey and Ringe, your education is worse than if you're in Conval. And we should not have a statewide education system where your education is determined based off the zip code you live in.
Right.
And that's the basic fundamental of it. Now, the monetary side that's gonna convince these other towns, part of this is, I think, a comprehensive attempt at leadership of the state. So it isn't just swept and then remunerating that money back to the towns in the proper way. It's also doing what we can at a state level to offset some of the other municipal costs, retirement and others. And if we have that in a comprehensive package, if Democrats take the state house back, and instead of just rah-rah-rahing for an income tax, we go for a swept reform that distributes that money back properly back to the towns, and then says to them also, we're looking at a comprehensive reformation of the system of retirement and a few of the other ways that we fund the municipalities. The overall tax burden in that kind of leadership, comprehensive reform to the tax system would go down. And that's what happened in 1999. It wasn't just swept. They did a few other things that brought money into the municipalities that brought the overall tax burden in every 234 town and city in our state down. And so we could do that again. And so there will be Democrats who represent wealthy towns. This was part of the debate that we had last time when we filed SWEP. Marjorie Smith, Peter, and I were on the bill. There were Democrats that voted against the bill on the House floor because they represent towns that are withholding these excess funds and they don't want to hurt their town. You get it. You're representing your districts, you've got to vote for your district. However, I think part of what leadership will do next term, if they care about lowering people's property tax bills, will be to go to those individual members. It's about 12, it's not many, in a caucus of 200 people, and say, hey, look, I understand you've got an individual town that's withholding about, a couple $1 million.
Right.
I get it, it must feel nice to have a couple $1 million in your school's bank to be able to offset the cost of an education which you are already fully funding for your students. We are here as a Democratic caucus to make sure that this state's tax system works for everyone in it. And the towns like Jaffrey and Ringe, who are using their high property taxes to fund at a lower level an education that doesn't meet the standard of education as it should be.
I don't think you should say that anymore, because I worked in that district, and that is a good district.
Well, it's a fine district, but I'm going to continue to say it because the people in Jaffrey and Ringe feel it. The people in Jaffrey and Ringe, when they have meth happening in their school, when people are overdosing in the middle of the bathroom, feel like their school's a little bit different than Conval's, which that doesn't happen in. The people in Jaffrey and Ringe feel like their school's a little bit worse off because they don't get the same opportunities to go to the good schools that my peers in Conval did. The people in Jaffrey and Ringe feel worse off, and I'm telling you the experience of the peers as it just was happening, the students' experience. So I get working there, it might have felt differently than what the students are feeling coming out. But I'm telling you, the peers who I'm talking to now know that they're getting a worse education than if they were in Souhegan or Conval. And that is the fact. And we as a state need to acknowledge that because Souhegan, my friend from Souhegan over there, he just gave me we need to acknowledge that, because if we continue to say, oh, but Jaffrey Ridge is a good school, it is a good school. These people are working with very little resources and providing a good education to some of their students. But it needs to be fully funded, and that school, when fully funded, will have the same educational opportunities like Palmdale does, which are far and away better than Jaffrey Ridge. And so that is an important point to bring up, and if we're going to convince these towns and cities that we need a statewide education system that makes sure that every child in this state gets the best education available to them, then we're gonna have to talk about the reality of some of these schools. Claremont, Jaffrey and Ringe, other schools, the reality on the ground there needs to be discussed, and it is not a good one. And the more that we say that we can't discuss it, the more it plays into the hands of the Republican Party, who are using the hatred that people have, like peers of mine, of public school because of the atrophy it's happened, to generate their ideas of destroying the system. It just doesn't work. It's a prison system. You're basically going there, you're just a child care facility. These things are what the Republicans are using to generate anti-public school beliefs. If we're gonna counter that, we have to acknowledge that public school is not working in the way that it should, and move forward to comprehensively reform it so that it can. Part of that is acknowledging Jaffrey and Ringe is in a way worse situation than Palmdale. And that is something that has been said to me by peers of mine who would have gone on to go to Ivy Leagues and were not able to because of the opportunities that they went going through Palmdale. I mean, that's what they said.
I could have a, we'll have a whole person.
I look forward to it.
When Palmdale was one of the better high schools in the state, Jaffrey Ridge was also under our SAU office. We had the one SAU.
All right,
office.
Satya
All
Gun.
together.
Yes.
Right, yeah. So anyway, that's interesting.
Maybe a stupid question, but what
There's no
does,
stupid questions.
what does SWEP stand for?
Statewide education property tax. That was not a stupid question, I should have said it. That's, you know, you talk about these things so much, you think everyone hears about it, but that's what it stands for.
You mentioned earlier that, New Hampshire, 60% of education is funded by property tax. but
60% of the whole state government is funded by
It's funded by property tax, more so than any other state. Right, and, this reform that you're talking about, to reform the SWEP system, won't really change that.
No, no.
So
But-
what is there, changing that seems to be an important thing for the benefit of the entire state, so what can be done to change that?
Well, it's a good point. I mean, the state, part of what, when we get accredited by the credit rating agencies, as Peter knows far better than I do, I can sort of talk about this, Peter has lived it for the last 20-some odd years, but the credit rating agencies look at the diversity each state has of its revenue. And so the less diversity you have, the worse off, generally speaking, your credit rating will be. Now, New Hampshire has maintained a pretty decent credit rating because we keep money in the bank. Our treasury and treasurer do a pretty good job at keeping our credit levels high. Now, if anything were ever to happen, if there were to be if the United States defaulted or something like that, we would be in a really tough situation because we get, $11 billion from the federal government. It's a significant chunk of our budget that comes from the federal government. About 5. And that's like Medicaid, Medicare, that's a super amount. $5 billion is a hard amount of money to comprehend. It's like, we talk about $40 trillion.
What percentage
$5 billion is
of
very
the
hard.
Hampshire budget comes from the federal government?
Well, about 5 billion, so out of 15 and a half, 5 billion,
30%.
about a third, yeah.
So it's property taxes and the federal government.
I mean, essentially, and then there's a few taxes, regulations, and fees. Now, SWEPT is an important reform that I believe needs to happen because we need a fair statewide education system, and then the tax system needs to be uniform and proportional. These are all constitutional mandates that this legislature has. SWEPT and the SWEPT reform that I'm proposing and that Marjorie has proposed and that people have proposed for the last 20 years, it's not my issue. This is something that I'm just sort of tacking myself onto for, being a figurehead after 20 years of this fight. This is an issue where we are trying to meet our constitutional mandates. Diversification of the state revenue systems, bringing back the interest and dividends tax, introducing some of these other small taxes and fees, for a diverse revenue stream that funds specific systems, that will help lower that number down below the 60% threshold that's out there. Yeah.
I asked the guys for permission talking about money. This Saturday is the annual Peterborough Democrats fundraiser. And because of the work on the bridge, we will not be in Putnam Park, we will be where they do the concerts behind Toll School.
Depot Square.
It's, yeah, Depot
Yes.
Squares, from 9 to 12:30.
I thought it was 8.
Well, starting dropping off stuff, but it's kind of 9 to 12:30. We appreciate people coming, because that money is going to be, and there'll be things there for gardens, big goods, for people to buy, and buy donation.
Yeah,
throw
donation
money in.
only.
And this is for, like, Jonah
Well,
and Peter.
no, it's actually not for us, it's for like,
Well,
what I was
wait a
gonna
minute.
say to the answer to you, which is these other candidates around us, Hillsborough, Antrim, and, oh, you just mixed me up. Hillsborough,
Jaffrey,
Antrim.
Dublin.
No,
You let
hold
me
on, I'm getting
finish.
jumbled. But it's
These
true, not for us,
Peter,
but for these other
Jonah,
districts
for
around us.
other state reps, for the people down in the nitty gritty, working for $100 a year, out there fighting for our rights.
We're not
So-
taking any money, John.
No, we are not.
You're not.
But, so they, ignore their faces, state rep, whether you're in Dublin, Jaffrey, around here, really important, and that is the one big fundraiser we do a year is the Peterborough Democratic Town Committee, so that we can have people like Jonah and Peter in office fighting for us.
Thank you, Deb. That was important.
Yeah.
That is one of the best events of the year. It's just fun to sit with like-minded people and talk about things. It's actually a very good event. Each year I'm like, I gotta wake up
And
somewhere
take
for
home
this on a
goodies and
Saturday.
veggies.
Exactly, you know, it's pretty cool. Any final questions before we wrap up? Awesome. Well, I want to just respond really quickly to Ben's question, which was a very important one. So, it makes me think of the Bentham's Prison, which was an idea created in 1791 by a man named Bentham. And he was a utilitarian looking for a prison that would help the most people, as utilitarians do. His idea for a prison was one in which it was a circular room with the prison cells surrounding a guard tower with opaque windows. And that guard tower, you never knew if the guard was in it or not. And so every so often, someone would come out and prosecute bad behavior on the floor of that prison, and after a while of that happening, you think to yourself, oh, that guard tower must just always have someone in it. And so all of us, I mean, my grandmother and mother are in town from Florida right now. They relay a story of me when I was in Animal Kingdom. My grandmother had brought me to the Animal Kingdom, and one of the employees is right in front of me, and I'm about 4 years old, just sitting there, she's trying to talk to me, like, trying to disappear. Because I don't think anyone truly likes to be perceived. Being perceived changes our behavior. There's plenty of really good studies about that. And so, Ben, as we enter our own sort of digital Bentham's prison, where the cameras everywhere, and you and I as younger people have grown up, and you can see sort of the marked difference between younger and older people who have grown up in this world of constant, not just surveillance, but observation. You are constantly being observed, and it's changed fundamentally our behavior. And so we are going into not just the surveillance state of Edward Snowden in the early aughts and 2010s, we are going into a digital prison, the likes of which we may never be able to escape. And this is a digital prison using the technologies of Flock, Axon, these cameras that aren't just recording your license plate. They are recording the emotions on your face. They are using artificial intelligence to determine whether or not you're having a good day or a bad day. They're using artificial intelligence to record your every move and your every behavior in a way that you don't even know yourself. That's a dangerous world. And these people, the tech oligarchs who are running these companies, are very dangerous people. We exposed them in the early 2000s, they being the surveillance state. After the Patriot Act, people vociferously spoke up against that, and the government learned. They said, we should privatize this security state. And so that's exactly what they've done. They've privatized the surveillance state in Flock, Axon, And the data centers I see as not being used for the language models and your questions about whatever that might be on ChatGPT. It's used to process the data that is being remitted from a nation surveilled. And so as we, a legislature, a public sector, the only organization with the ability to deal with this, looks at this situation, I think Peter and I and many others are going to have a lot to do in terms of making sure that we protect the civil liberties of the human beings in our society. And New Hampshire is very privileged to have within its state constitution privacy protections that are very good, and we should expand those privacy protections to include the technological world that we're living in today. I don't have the exact answers for you right now. It's easy to say we're going to ban flock cameras. You know, I mean, I think that's maybe an interesting solution, but how do you do that without banning surveillance cameras writ large? You got to work these things out in a proper way. What I can say though, Ben, is that they call them flock for a reason. They see us as sheep. We are not sheep. We are thinking, curious, intelligent human beings, capable of a human society, a free society, in which all of our privacies and civil liberties are protected. And that is not going to come through a tech oligarch world where we give the keys to our society to these unaccountable, unelected, private organizations. And I can promise you right now, I'll make one of the very few promises I'll make as an elected official, I will never stop until this digital prison is dealt with and until our free rights, civil liberties, and protections are protected by the government which we serve in. So thank you very much for that question. It's a very important one.
And thank you all for coming. We've been here, I'll send out the email for September, and yeah, we'll be getting back to this, so thank you all very much.